They say some people are born to be monsters, but what if a monster could look exactly like a man? In the darkest corners of the Soviet Gulag, one officer did not eat, did not sleep, and appeared only when someone was about to die. Prisoners whispered about him, and some even claimed he was not human at all. He was not just enforcing rules. He was controlling life and death, shaping obedience with terrifying precision. And no one dared to question him, not even the most defiant. Some say he could read your fear. Some say he could choose who lived and who never woke up again. Tonight, we'll reveal the chilling story of the NKVD officer who defied time, morality, and humanity itself. A man whose presence turned despair into silent compliance. What really happened inside those frozen camps? And how did one man, or something far stranger, change everything? Watch closely. You will not believe what you're about to see, until it's too late. Morning in the camp always began the same way, with a whistle that cut through sleep like a dull knife and forced men out of their bunks before their bodies were ready to move. Frost clung to the inside of the barrack walls. Breath turned instantly into pale clouds, and boots scraped against the wooden floor as prisoners lined up, half awake and already exhausted. Nothing about these mornings felt remarkable. Hunger, cold, routine. All of it was expected, familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. Abram Levin woke, as he always did, a few seconds before the whistle. Years of work as a watchmaker had trained his body to anticipate time, even when time itself had lost meaning. He sat up slowly, careful not to waste energy, swung his legs down, and began wrapping the rags around his feet that served as socks. Around him, men coughed, cursed quietly, or stared into space with the vacant expressions of those who had learned not to hope for rest. Outside, guards shouted numbers. Rifles clacked. The day assembled itself piece by piece. Levin stepped into the line, eyes down, counting breaths. He noticed the cold first, then the ache in his joints, then the smell of thin porridge drifting from the kitchen. Only after all that did he register Major Sokolov standing near the administrative building, exactly where he stood every morning. Sokolov's presence was so routine that most prisoners barely registered it anymore. He was simply part of the camp, like the fences or the watchtowers. Tall, straight-backed, always immaculate, he observed roll call without speaking, hands clasped behind him, eyes scanning the rows of men with calm disinterest. Levin had seen him every day for months and could not recall a single instance of the major doing anything unexpected. That, at first, was what made him unremarkable. The workday unfolded with mechanical regularity. The prisoners were marched into the forest to fell trees, the sound of axes biting into frozen wood echoing dully. Guards smoked, shouted, checked lists. Someone stumbled and was kicked back to his feet. Someone else collapsed and was dragged aside to be dealt with later. Levin focused on his task, counting strokes, conserving strength. By evening, the men returned to the camp in silence. Supper was ladled out, thin and gray. Night roll call followed. Sokolov was there again, standing near the path between the barracks, his face unreadable in the dim light. Nothing happened. Men slept. Some dreamed. Some did not wake. This was how days passed, identical, interchangeable. The camp ground men down not through spectacle, but through repetition, through the certainty that tomorrow would look exactly like today. It took Levin weeks to notice the first deviation, and even then it was so small he almost dismissed it. One evening, while repairing a broken hinge in the tool shed after hours, he glanced toward the yard and saw Sokolov standing in his usual place. The night was bitterly cold, colder than it had been all winter, and Levin found himself watching out of idle curiosity as minutes passed. Sokolov did not move. Levin told himself this was nothing. Discipline, training, pride, officers were different. Still, when Levin finished his work and returned to the barracks nearly 2 hours later, Sokolov was still there, in the same posture, facing the same direction. The next morning, Levin woke early and stepped outside before roll call was fully assembled. Sokolov stood where he always did, as if he had never left. Levin frowned, then shook the thought away. He had no way of knowing whether Sokolov had been there all night. Guards rotated shifts. Officers had offices, quarters, beds. Life went on. It was only after the death of a man named Viktor Kravitz that Levin began to pay attention in earnest. Kravitz had been a miner, broad-shouldered and stubborn, someone who complained openly and survived mostly out of spite. The night before his death, Sokolov had stopped near Barrack 5 during final rounds. Levin remembered this because it had been unusual. Sokolov rarely approached the living quarters. In the morning, Kravitz was found dead in his bunk. There were no marks on him, no blood, no sign of struggle. The camp doctor muttered something about the heart and filled out the paperwork without enthusiasm. Bodies appeared regularly in the camp. One more meant nothing. Except that 2 nights later, Sokolov stopped near Barrack 2. And the next morning, a man from Barrack 2 did not wake up. Levin began to notice patterns, not because he was brave or curious, but because noticing patterns was how he had survived his entire life. He noticed that Sokolov was present only on certain nights. He noticed that when Sokolov appeared closer to the barracks, someone died before dawn. Always one, never more. He also noticed something else, something that disturbed him more deeply. No one ever saw Sokolov eat. Meals in the camp were public affairs. Guards ate in shifts, officers in the administrative building, but people noticed who came and went. Sokolov was never seen in the mess. He was never seen with a cup or a cigarette. He did not even warm his hands at the stove during the coldest nights. Levin began to observe discreetly, telling himself it was idle curiosity, nothing more. He watched Sokolov's face during daylight and saw no fatigue, no redness in the eyes, no slackness around the mouth. The major looked exactly the same at night as he did in the morning, as he did week after week. Levin shared his thoughts cautiously with Sergei Volkov, a former history teacher who worked alongside him in the forest. "You're imagining things," Volkov said at first, though without conviction. "This place does that to people." "Do you remember when he arrived?" Levin asked. Volkov thought for a long moment. "No," he admitted. "I assumed he was already here." Others, when asked, said the same. Guards avoided the question altogether. The camp doctor, Mikhail Yefremov, reacted differently. When Levin mentioned the pattern of deaths, Yefremov went pale and told him to forget it. "Some things," Yefremov said quietly, "are not meant to be understood here." As winter deepened, the sense of wrongness grew harder to ignore. Sokolov began appearing more often. The camp had received a new transport, men who still talked loudly, argued, whispered about survival and escape. On those nights, Sokolov stood closer to the barracks, his presence pressing against the walls like a weight. Deaths followed. Still, nothing about it was dramatic. No screams, no blood. The camp absorbed each loss the way it absorbed everything else, with dull resignation. Levin found himself watching Sokolov the way one watched bad weather, knowing it was dangerous but unable to look away. One night, driven by a strange impulse, he deliberately scuffed his boot against the frozen ground near where Sokolov stood. The sound echoed sharply. Sokolov did not turn his head, did not blink. But Levin felt with absolute certainty that he had been noticed. From that moment on, the ordinary routines of the camp began to feel staged, like a thin layer covering something vast and patient underneath. Levin understood dimly that whatever Sokolov was, he was not an anomaly. He was a consequence. The camp administration reacted slowly, reluctantly, and only when denial became inconvenient. Weeks passed with no change. Men continued to vanish quietly from their bunks. Paperwork continued to be filed. The forest continued to swallow sound. What did change was Levin. Once the idea had taken root, he could not stop seeing it. Sokolov no longer blended into the background of the camp. He stood out like a flaw in reality, subtle but persistent. Levin began structuring his days around observation, memorizing where Sokolov stood, when he appeared, how long he remained. Sokolov never acknowledged him, not once. That indifference felt deliberate. Dr. Yefremov was the first to voice what many had begun to feel. "This place is emptying," he said quietly, as Levin helped him pack medical supplies that no one had officially ordered packed. "Not just of people, of purpose." "What happens to him when it's gone?" Levin asked. Yefremov's hands paused mid-motion. "That is the wrong question," he said. "The right one is what happens to everything else." Transfers began 3 days later. Trucks arrived, coughed smoke, and carried men away in small groups. Some were sent to other camps. Some were released with papers they did not trust. Each departure felt provisional, as if it might be revoked at any moment. Levin and Volkov remained. So did Sokolov. On the fourth night, something unprecedented happened. Sokolov left his post. Levin saw it from the barracks window, at first disbelieving his own eyes. The major turned from the yard and walked toward the forest, not toward the administrative buildings or the gate, but directly into the trees. His pace was unhurried, purposeful. Levin felt a sharp, irrational panic. He dressed quickly and followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows, every instinct screaming that this was a mistake. Snow muffled sound. The forest swallowed the camp's lights within a few steps, and darkness pressed close. Sokolov stopped in a small clearing Levin had never noticed before, though it could not have been far from the perimeter. The trees there were older, thicker, their trunks twisted in ways that suggested slow, deliberate strain. The air felt heavier. Sokolov stood at the center and removed his cap. It was the first time Levin had ever seen his head uncovered. His hair was dark, neatly combed, untouched by gray. His scalp bore no scars, no marks of age. "You may come closer," Sokolov said. Levin froze. "You have been observing for a long time," Sokolov continued. "It would be inefficient to stop now." Levin stepped forward, his legs trembling despite his effort to control them. "What are you?" Levin asked. Sokolov considered the question. "That depends on the scale at which you are asking." The answer made no sense, and yet Levin felt it was honest. Levin's private notebooks were not meant to survive him. He wrote in them at night, by hand, with a slowness that felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. Each page held a single account, a name, a face as he remembered it, a small fragment of life before the camp, and the manner in which that life had narrowed and ended. He did not analyze, he did not contextualize, he did not explain. At first, the act felt futile. These stories had no audience, no influence. They would not correct policy or shift discourse. They did not fit into any system that rewarded coherence. That, Levin suspected, was precisely why they mattered. His wife noticed the change in him before anyone else. He spoke less at dinner, listened more. He flinched when certain phrases appeared on the radio, words he had once used himself without hesitation. Optimization, stabilization, necessary measures. "You look like you're waiting for something," she said one evening. Levin considered the thought. "I think," he said slowly, "I'm trying to stop waiting." The world, however, did not stop. One of Levin's former students, a bright and ambitious analyst, came to see him under the pretense of seeking advice. The man spoke eagerly about his work, about new frameworks for managing unrest, about predictive models that identified when populations approached dangerous dissatisfaction. Levin listened in silence. "It's elegant," the man said. "Clean, no violence, no visible coercion." "And when it works?" Levin asked. The man smiled. "People adapt." Levin saw then what he had not wanted to see before. The function had evolved. It no longer required a fixed presence, no singular interface like Sokolov. It diffused itself through language, through metrics, through well-meaning professionals who believed sincerely in harm reduction. Sokolov had been crude by comparison. That night, Levin dreamed again of the forest clearing. But Sokolov did not stand alone this time. The clearing was crowded with figures, indistinct but upright, each facing a different direction, each wearing a different face. Some were young, some old. Some wore uniforms, some wore suits. Some looked like ordinary men on their way to ordinary jobs. All of them stood perfectly still. Levin woke with his heart pounding and a single, unbearable certainty. The function did not oppose humanity. It emerged from it. The shock came not as an event, but as a recognition that had been delayed too long. There had never been a moment when Sokolov chose to appear. He manifested when enough people accepted inevitability as truth, when resistance became inefficient, when suffering was reframed as data. The camps had not summoned him. They had revealed him. Levin understood then the final cruelty of the system. It did not need monsters. It produced them organically, shaping human roles until something inhuman could wear them comfortably. His notebooks began to circulate after his death, passed quietly between readers who found them unsettling and difficult to categorize. They were not histories. They offered no lessons. They did not point forward. Some critics dismissed them as incomplete, irresponsible. Others felt something harder to name. Years later, a junior official in a newly formed agency read one of Levin's notebooks late at night and could not sleep afterward. The names lingered. The lack of explanation gnawed at him. For the first time in his career, he felt uncertainty not as a problem to solve, but as a warning. He hesitated the next day before approving a recommendation. That hesitation altered nothing measurable, but it mattered. Far from there, in a city that prided itself on efficiency, a man stood near a glass building at night, watching the lights flicker off floor by floor. He did not wear a uniform. He did not need to. His posture was familiar, though no one who passed him could have said why. He checked nothing. He waited. He was not Sokolov. Sokolov had been a prototype. This iteration was quieter, more adaptable, more human. And somewhere, buried in archives and half-remembered testimonies, the idea of inevitability continued to do its work, convincing people that what was happening could not be helped, only managed. Levin was old before he realized the final truth. His hair had thinned, his hands shook slightly, and his memory no longer held names as clearly as it once had. Yet the notebooks remained. It stacked neatly on a shelf in his study, and each page a testament to what he had witnessed, and to the lives he had catalogued, and to the horror he had survived. He told himself he had written them to resist, to preserve the human element against abstraction. But resistance, he discovered too late, is a subtle trap. One autumn evening, as the sun sank behind gray clouds, Levin received a letter without a return address. The envelope was plain, the paper heavy, almost like parchment. Inside was a single sheet, typed, yet devoid of any date, letterhead, or signature. The words were simple, almost bureaucratic. Observation continues. Your participation is noted. Efficiency is optimal. Future alignment recommended. Levin's first instinct was disbelief. He laughed quietly, placing the letter on the table. Then he read it again, and felt a coldness creep into his chest, the kind he had not felt since the forest clearing decades ago. He had not recognized it then, but Sokolov's function was no longer a person. It never had been. It had always been a mechanism, an interface between human compliance and structural inevitability. And he had been drawn in, willingly or not, to perpetuate it. The truth struck with a clarity that was almost painful. By teaching, explaining, moderating, he had been a vector. Each calm lecture, every article written in measured tones, every reassurance that suffering could be mitigated without resisting the system, all of it had served the function. The human component of horror, the quiet submission to inevitability, had spread not through force, but through him. Levin had not replaced Sokolov. He had become something far more useful. The final confirmation came years later, when Levin was invited to consult on a project described only as behavioral stabilization. He read the proposal in a quiet office, his hands steady. The language was familiar. Thresholds, saturation, redistribution. No camps, no guards, no deaths on paper, just optimization. Levin closed the folder. For the first time since the camp, he felt genuine fear, not of punishment, of choice. He could refuse. He could speak differently. He could abandon explanation and name cruelty plainly, without mitigation or context. But he understood now how costly that would be. Systems resisted disruption. Interfaces were replaced when they failed. Levin looked at his reflection in the window. Older, tired, human, still human. He stood up, walked to the door, and left the building without signing anything. The consequences were not immediate. Invitations slowed. His voice faded from panels. Younger experts took his place, fluent in the same language, sharper, more adaptable. Levin watched them from a distance and recognized the pattern. The function no longer needed him. That, strangely, felt like freedom. In his final years, Levin wrote privately, not essays or analyses, but names. Lists of individuals. Stories without conclusions. Accounts that refused to explain or justify. They were not widely read, but some readers did not leave calm. Sometimes that was enough. Levin understood at last that there was no escape, not because the system was unbreakable, but because the system existed inside him, and inside anyone who observed, measured, and rationalized. Sokolov had never needed Levin to act on his behalf. He had needed Levin to translate to take the raw horror of the camps and render it intelligible, acceptable, distant, to ensure that when the function reappeared, it would be recognized not as a monster, but as necessity. Levin closed the notebooks and stared out the window. The city moved, oblivious, efficient, self-regulating. People smiled, argued, built, repaired, and obeyed without realizing that the invisible architecture around them had been designed to channel inevitability itself. Levin understood at last. There was no Sokolov. There was only the interface, and anyone who believed they resisted was already a part of it. The story ends with quiet complicity, a revelation that shocks because it forces the reader to question their own role in the invisible systems that surround them.